Thanks very much indeed. And look, thanks for having me. And I skew none of my talk towards Kent and Medway, but that isn't, I hope, heard disrespectfully so much as you're the experts in the place where you live. As mentioned, I'm Toby. I've been a chief exec in the NHS for 10 years, working, I suppose, unusually across all sectors. I was a visiting fellow of the King's Fund, and I have an abiding interest professionally and practically in health inequalities and poverty. I guess whenever I'm asked to talk in these kind of spaces, I tend to begin by reminding myself that the NHS in particular has a habit of interposing itself in discussions about community wellbeing, inequalities and poverty, while sitting atop a white charger and arriving as if it's the only institution locally that could do anything. And if everybody else could just take half a step back, we're here and you don't need to worry. As the sarcasm in that comment hopefully illustrates, I think one of the challenges we have in this space is a challenge of mutual and institutional humility. And you asked, say, why we were here. I'm always interested in joining communities of practice that have at their heart co-production, because I suppose I believe, despite the very good living that the NHS has given me over 30 years, that we don't naturally step into those spaces. So I've got just 3 or 4 slides, and I guess my theme is less about what we might do and more about what some of the questions of practical translation that we face are. And I'm not giving a talk based on presenting you with answers so much as allowing you to test whether my questions are some of the questions that resonate, particularly where you are. In case you're wondering whether Mavis, who is the nice lady who worked with us, who's on the front of my institutional strategy, is there as some form of prop, I guess Mavis is here because the institutional future of the organisation I'm now lucky enough to be chief executive of is founded in 28 promises that were built with our local community, which are all about shifting the balance of power in our part of South Yorkshire. I love my Chris Whitty moments. If I could move on to the second of my 5 slides, that would be fantastic. I'm going to present essentially a set of hypotheses, I guess, born of my experiences over that career and that work that I've done. And the first one is that in the world of inequalities of health and well-being and of poverty, I haven't come to the conclusion that we have a lack of evidence. And I don't simply mean evidence of the harm and the disparities that Hilary has very expertly reminded us of. What I mean is evidence of what to do. Part of that white chargerism that I referred to in introducing myself is that as a public health student in my spare time or as an NHS leader, I find myself very often in rooms where people will agree very readily we should do something about health inequalities and exclusion, and then busily come together to come up with their favourite ideas that they've thought of about what we should do. And there's something, particularly in a research space such as this, there's something somewhat discomforting about that resort to everybody's lived experience and best suggestion in the face of an absolute litany of evidence of what we should do. Now, I've given just the one example there, which is the nice guidance on homelessness. I have a very personal connection with the journey to producing that evidence, and I've enjoyed working with OHID in trying to promote it. As I've gone about doing that, it reinforces, colleagues, my hypothesis, because it's staggering the number of health and care systems around the country, and I haven't been to 40 or 42, but in the course of the last 5 years, I've been to many of them, who do not start their work in a space like homeless exclusion by saying, here is a validated set of evidence of what we should do, why don't we just go and do it? Now, many of you on this call who are researchers and academics will be resonating with that experience in your working life, but it really is striking in the space of health inequalities how much we are at risk of not looking for the evidence of what works and not holding ourselves to account for actually making sure that that happens where we are. If you're furiously Googling this evidence to see if it works in Kent Medway, fantastic. My first purpose in this talk has been served. Before all of our talks over the last few minutes amount to a counsel of despair about the profound difficulties of austerity in our country, and I've had so many purdah warnings for this talk that I'm on tenterhooks as I go through. I think it is important to remind ourselves that stuff does work and that we do make a difference to health inequalities. Now, I happen to have used the NAO. If you go through John Ford's work at Cambridge, you would find perhaps a more academic illustration of this, but it manifestly is the case that in the first 10 years of this century, at least on the indices that I've chosen to show you there was impact on health inequalities. And at the very least, in the case of the first two bullet points, whilst we don't have a causal chain, we can reasonably hypothesize that that came from joint institutional action, not just at a central government level, but at a local level. And we know that because actually it was the narrowing in the most deprived communities that had been the focus of work. My friend Dave Buck and others worked on those national and local programmes and reported them with me for the King's Fund. It's worth understanding that there isn't a council of absolute despair here. There is a trajectory that got better, and there has been a trajectory that has got worse. And I would argue that in that trajectory of things getting worse, we abandoned the things that we knew and had found worked in doing exactly what's described on this slide. And then, as Hilary has taken you through, Michael and the health equity team have illustrated, if you like, the what happens next story. My point isn't that it was all smashing and great. My point was there was enough green shoots of improvement that you would want to build and nurture and cultivate what had been done. We don't have an evidence problem, and we have seen what works work. We could move on. My next slide is drawn directly from my other talk that I give in this space, which is called Could We Abolish All the Pilots? That probably isn't going to help the purpose of your launch, so bear with the whole sentence. The other behaviour that health and care systems have, in addition to not following the evidence faced with health inequalities, is to have a thing that makes me feel better about myself because we're doing something, but it is fundamentally an initiative or a project. Now, I illustrate some of those on the left of my slide. Some of them I've been very personally involved with, the homelessness project in Sandwell and the work we're doing on mental health here in the centre of Doncaster. And I'm not in any way suggesting that those of you that are here, if you like, for the inspiration of projects around the country shouldn't Google some of these things and find what they have done and what they have amounted to. I guess what I am saying is that it seems to me that those projects and those pilots are going to sit best within the context of a much wider approach that tries to build those pilots, if you like, as bricks in the wall, rather than as individual initiatives operating in isolation. Bolo Owolabi, who you will know is the National Health Inequalities Director, gives a wonderful talk that begins with the St Basil's Live and Work project that myself and others gave birth to 13 years ago in the West Midlands. The tragedy of that project is it's the only such one that has happened in its type in the country, despite the efficacy of its effects in taking hundreds of people out of the use of benefits, the use of substances, and living on the streets. So the failure of replication, I guess, is part of the point of my slide. The three bold points are maybe things to think about and to take away as you go through the day. Typically non-statutory actors, almost always misusing the money that somebody gave you for another purpose, and categorically finding the edge of spaces that others won't go to. Absolutely finding those edges at the margins of the lives that are often lived by decision makers and researchers, and trying to work out with people what will make a difference in that space. So please don't despair on the pilots, but as my final two slides talk about, I think we need to move a little beyond that. Next slide, please. Now, this slide draws on what I'm saying instead of or in addition to pilots. This is a conversation about power. It's not a conversation about health outcomes alone. And if you want to have a conversation about power, you have to look at the systemic framing of how we do things institutionally round here. When we looked back at the work on health inequalities, both that 10-year period of a little success that I referred to earlier, and the following 10 years that nobody, I think, could regard as national level success that followed, we came to the conclusion that partnerships were not enough. Partnerships are a necessary condition. They are doubtless essential, but there were other things that we needed to bring into the mix. And they may appear to this sophisticated audience quite paradoxical. So on the one hand, we needed the disruptive energy of being able to move to a more preventive model in a system that wants to treat the after effects of the harm that comes from the lives we lead. And on the other hand, against that, we needed to create a sense that we were in this for the long term, hence the phrase endurance that is at the top of the slide and was the title of the report that we published a couple of years ago. So somehow, as voluntary partnerships like this one or as institutional actors, we have to find a duality between the ability to disrupt and the ability to endure, to create a sense that it's worth leaning in to the Rotherham project that Hilary was describing, because we're going to be with this for the longer term, rather than that is this year's one-off thing that you can spend your spare time on if you want to. So there's a real challenge when you're thinking about how to mobilize, I'm suggesting to the event, in how you balance those three variables that are on the left-hand side of this penultimate slide. The second thing that we found, and that I would urge you to consider in your local context, is that the world of health inequalities and exclusion is absolutely overrun with data. If I wanted to demonstrate the last 30 years, I would have so much data, my talk would go on an awful lot longer. But it's very, very, very short on immediate operationalizable data that a local team can be working with in the course of their daily collaboration or practice. Think about it if you would, when you get into your GP practice, you will be asked a range of information about your health status, and you may freely give that. But your GP is almost certainly sitting there with remarkably little information, for example, about the state of poverty that you are living in. And we are a little bit fey, I guess, of translating those more societal factors that have been spoken about by the other two presenters into information that people can use at a hyper local level on a daily basis. And that's a real barrier to advancing the cause of innovation and practice in this space. Again, we published on this, and there are a few examples on the slide to whet your appetite of teams that are trying to use and misuse data. My favourite one actually isn't on the slide. It's the use of water bill arrears in Yorkshire to try and identify people who might be at risk of falling into poverty and destitution. But that identification poses a different question, I would suggest, which is how comfortable are we with the preventive anticipatory intervention in the life course of human beings, rather than reacting to them as institutional actors when they put their hand up for help. So these two things on this slide, I guess, are the heart of my talk in terms of how do we do better as a system if we know what to do and we know why to do it, as previous speakers have spoken to. We just move to the final slide. Even in Yorkshire, it's a little bit early for one of your speakers to talk about cocktails, but nonetheless, I do think this is a conversation not about new ingredients, but about how you bring that mix of the things you know you need to do together. And like any decent cocktail, some of it is in the order and in the quantity with which you act. And I would suggest to you that that is one of the fascinating research spaces that we face. Think about all the work we've done on homelessness over the last 30 years in this country. And then it's the Finns who come and tell us that if you give someone the house first, not eventually, you make the determinative difference. So the mix and the sequence are super important, which is why my last 30 seconds is I'm not sure you need more money to tackle these issues. I'm sure, Alice, you and your institution might need more money. I'm not sure the country needs to spend more money to tackle these things. We already spend a fortune on the costs of inequalities, but we may need to resculpt and reimagine whose money it is and how it is layered between us. And critically, we need to be interested in effect size and effects, because the reason we're in this research recycling activity that I've described in my talk is that we're insufficiently clear what effect we're expecting, for whom, and the scale of impact we need. And so we're trapped in these individual small projects where, if we could mobilize a community of practice, for example, through this collaboration, you get the cumulative effect of a series of things done at the same time in different ways, with all the richness of experimentation that brings. I hope that's of some interest to you. Thanks very much for listening to me. Cheers.